and welcome to today's webinar, the first one in the Resilience series. Today, we'll be talking about cybersecurity. My name is Yuri Ramos, and I'm a program director at MIT Corporate Relations. On behalf of MIT ILP, the Industrial Liaison Program, I'm very excited to be your host today. Since its founding in 1948, the ILP has been a gateway for our industry into innovation ecosystem that surrounds us. During this challenging COVID time, we developed an extensive webinar series. You can learn more about our next events at our website, ilp.mit.edu under the Attend tab. Well, during the COVID age, cybersecurity concerns have grown as a result of many factors, not least of which is a direct result from individuals being sentenced, maybe as many of you guys here, to work from home. Companies are also more vulnerable to cyber crimes as they try to operate as much as possible remotely or face temporary or even permanent closures. Think the lessons learned during this exceptional time, two questions. First, what are the key steps to build a stronger and resilient system? And lastly, taking a step back, what are some key threats companies should address? But before we proceed, there are a few things, logistics, I would like to cover. So this presentation will be recorded and available to the ILP members on our website, again, ilp.mit.edu. You may submit questions for the speakers through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can also, besides questions, you can also vote for questions in the Q&A to move the questions to the top of the list. And please use the chat only to communicate technical issues. And now let's go to what brought you guys here this Thursday. We're having two outstanding speakers today, both experts in cybersecurity. We'll start with Dr. Stuart Madnick, professor at MIT Sloan and also at the MIT School of Engineering. He's the founding director of CAMS, cybersecurity at MIT Sloan. He will present today Cybersafety, how to increase resilience by identifying and mitigating cyber risks. Stuart, over to you.
Very good. It's a pleasure to meet everybody today. Let me just pull up my slides. This is a great example of what I'm going to try to talk about today. And that is the issue of how do we deal with resiliency? And of course, what I mean by that is how do we deal with things that are unexpected, such as the problem I had in trying to find my slides to share them with you. And we're going to, in this session, I'm going to also talk a little bit about the notion of cyber safety, a method that we developed here at MIT to increase resiliency by identifying and mitigating these cyber risks. I also want to note we will have an opportunity for some Q&A at the end. But if there are some questions that we don't have a chance to get to today, or questions you think of afterward, on this screen and later on you'll also see it again, you have my email address as well as our website at MIT. So you're more than welcome to try to contact us to understand it more. So to try to address the issue of resiliency, let's stop back by talking about the issue of catastrophes. And there are many different types of catastrophes that we all can worry about. But in particular, there are many events, I use the example here of hurricanes and earthquakes that we cannot prevent, but of course there are things we can do to be more resilient. For example, those of you who live in areas that are frequented by hurricanes, although we can't necessarily predict exactly when they're going to occur, we can kind of get an idea from the weather forecasters that they are likely. And there are various things that can be set up in advance, such as evacuation routes and shelters. Earthquakes, on the other hand, are not as easy to predict ahead of time, but there are even things we can do to be more resilient there. I'm not sure if any of you have had the opportunity to visit the ancient village of Machu Picchu, but I visited that, and over 600 years ago, they realized that there were earthquakes in that area, and they designed the walls of their buildings using trapezoidal bricks. So as the building is shaking, it in fact will not crash down and so on. So there are things we can do. Even if we cannot prevent the event, we can make the impact of the event much less. So that's my notion of resiliency that I want to look at today. Now, what about cyber attacks? Well, cyber attacks are definitely very unpredictable, number one. But even more than that, one of the things that makes cyber attacks so concerning is often they are the first of their kind. I don't know in the case of hurricanes whether the levees in New Orleans had ever been breached before, but that's a possibility of something that may have been the first of its kind. So what we've learned to do with cyber attacks is not just think about what things have happened in the past, but think about what things could happen, because the mere fact they haven't happened yet doesn't mean they won't happen. That's what makes them extremely challenging. Now, what do I mean by types of catastrophes? Well, here are just a few examples of things that have happened in the past that some of you may or may not be aware of. There was a cyber attack on a Turkish pipeline causing this explosion. There was a cyber attack on a German steel mill that caused massive damage. Some of you may have heard about this because it actually happened several times. Cyber attacks on the Ukrainian power grid. And many of you may have seen in the news, although there's not been any major ones yet, there's been a large number of attempted or at least probings into the United States power grid. So I'm going to talk a few minutes. Many of you probably are familiar with, and maybe in some cases have experienced, what I would call an IT, an information technology cyber attack, something that may have affected you personally or affected your company, where either data was stolen or in some cases your computers were shut down. I'm going to talk about what I call cyber physical attacks, attacks that could attack a pipeline, a steel mill, a power grid. And they're somewhat different. There's several reasons why they're different. Number one, real physical damage can occur. You know, your computer getting clogged up is a problem. You may have to have your IT shop fix it up. But if something explodes, that's not an easy fix. Well, we're finding more and more, and this is true in almost every type of industry, but particularly in these industries, more and more of, quote, the safety mechanisms are also being controlled by the software. So if someone is able to attack the device, they're also often able to turn off or change the way the safety mechanisms work. Now, I don't know how many of you are engineers by training, as I am, and possibly many of the folks from MIT. In one regard, one of the things we've learned at MIT actually is misguided for us here now. If we're thinking about a power plant that, let's say, has 8 generators on it, we realize these generators are mechanical devices, and of course, over time, they will fail. And the chance of one fail may be fairly small, but the chance of 2 of them failing at the same time is very small. And the chance of 3 of them failing is very, very small, etc. And that's true when we're thinking about things in terms of independent physical failure, normal failures. But if there's a cyber attack that causes one generator to fail, or in some cases explode, that same cyber attack at about the same time could cause all of them to fail at the same time. And that's something that most of us, probably almost all of us, have never experienced yet. But that is a serious threat that we have to be aware of. Not only that, unlike you're going to your local computer store and getting a new laptop, getting a new generator is not something you can stop by at your local store to get. Many of these are custom made and designed, often taking months, in some cases years, to replace. So that's why I want to take a look at what these kinds of issues might be for all of us to think about. Now, at about this point, let me give you an example, by the way. This is a book, once again, I get no commission from it, by Ted Koppel, who many of you may know is a fairly well-noted television reporter. And the book was called Lights Out. But what I like particularly here is the phrase that says, America's power grid is not only possible, but likely, and that the United States is shockingly unprepared. And so that is the concern I have. Let me give you, and once again, these things are not new. This book came out actually a couple of years ago. So you might say, well, gee, was okay, maybe some of us may have been caught off guard in the past, but obviously many of the companies, the government, of course, MIT, are doing work to help prevent us, protect us from these such events. So first, I got some really good news for you. In terms of our ability to develop new tools and techniques to better protect us, the good guys are indeed getting better. But unfortunately, the bad news is that the bad guys are getting badder even faster. As this headline in the Washington Post says, hackers are getting better at offense and companies are not getting better at defense fast enough. And in fact, this gap is growing. And there are many reasons for this. I'll just give you a very few of them, if you don't mind. Interesting phenomenon. I don't know how many of you have had this experience in your own companies, but in general, companies do a relatively poor job of sharing information about their cyber attacks. Some things are required. If data is disclosed, like credit card data, there are certain laws requiring them to disclose that attack occurred. But as much as possible, attack on a power line or attacks on steel mills, in general, there's no law requiring them to be reported. And if so, the use of the information shared is very minimal for many reasons. Companies don't like to look bad. They're afraid that they announce that they've suffered an attack that may encourage copycats. And furthermore, it may make them vulnerable to certain types of legal actions. So the bad guys do a great job on the dark web of sharing methods, techniques at remarkably inexpensive cost, sometimes for free, just because they like to boast about it. And so in some sense, they're getting better at attacking and we're getting slower at being able to defend ourselves. Now, at this point, many would say, well, gee, I painted a fairly gloomy picture. If things are all that bad, how come we're not seeing that much more? And I have several ways of thinking about it. And once again, there may be other views as well. But I say there are three things need to be lined up for these types of attacks to take place. First thing, there needs to be an opportunity, a way for the bad guy to get in. If they can't get to us, then of course they can't do any of the things. For those of you who may work in industrial control industries and such, there is this notion called air gap. What air gap usually means is our plants, our facilities are not connected to the internet, so therefore there's no way to get in. Well, there's two problems with that. Number one, more and more of the equipment, that is smart grids, information, IoT, Internet of Things devices, more and more things are being connected all the time. And the motivations and incentives and benefits of being connected into it are tremendous. So it's harder and harder for organizations to be, in fact, air gapped. But even that doesn't stop you. For example, the Iranian enrichment plant that was attacked by Stuxnet was, in theory, air gapped, but that didn't stop them. So there's all kinds of ways a dedicated and persistent attacker will find a way to get in. And we can glad to share with you some of the clever tricks they use. The second thing is, well, okay, they can get in, but gee whiz, how can they do any harm? Doesn't that require millions, if not billions of dollars of research and development and special talent? And of course, all that is helpful, but in reality, that's not that hard. Cyber weapons are easily available on the dark web. In fact, some weapons, such as the ones that we used in the WannaCry attacks, for example, were weapons originally developed at huge cost by the National Security Agency of the US and were then stolen by cyber attackers who make them available for sale at discount prices on the dark web. So all kinds of weaponry, if you will, arms dealers, if you will, are out there selling these weapons, often stolen from governments and made available. So there's all kinds of capabilities out there for attacks. Then there's a last one, motivation. Well, here's the question. Why would someone want to shut down the power in the Paris grid or Boston or any country or city you want to think about? What is their benefit? And in most cases, there isn't you don't make a lot of money doing that. So it doesn't have the normal kind of payoff that a cyber attack that steals credit cards or a cyber attack that changes bank balances would have. But sometimes there are political goals or just angry people out there. And of course, if they have to be motivated to do such things and they can find the opportunity and they can develop the capability, it could happen. In fact, one of the things that makes these kind of attacks so ominous, if you will, if someone were to launch a missile, for example, at your city, usually there's all kinds of technology to trace where that missile came from and be able to respond. But a lot of these cyber attacks are protected by plausible deniability and misdirection. It was recently reported, once again, I take all these reports with a grain of salt, but it was reported that the Russians had managed to infiltrate the Iranian cyber attack area and were originating attacks directed by Russia, but coming out of Iran. So therefore, one would assume that it was the Iranians who initiated the attack. So there's all kinds of misdirection possible. My conclusion here is relying on the lack of motivation, and in most cases, just luck so far, is not a safe way to go forward. Once again, we'd be glad, Kerry and I, to talk to you more about our concerns. And once again, hopefully they're a bit overblown, but unfortunately, all the evidence is in the wrong direction. Things are getting worse every single day, every single year. Now, after having kind of hopefully gotten your attention with these issues, let's talk a little bit about what some things we can do about them. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. There's something that was originally called the White House Cybersecurity Framework, developed about 5 or 6 years back. It was then transferred over to the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, and is often referred to as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And I want to just give you a high-level view of it because I think if you haven't studied it, it really provides a very good insight into what it takes to be a much more resilient organization in dealing with these kinds of threats of all kinds. They identified 5 major areas. The first one they call identify. I find that phrase maybe not the best way to describe it. What I think it really means is to develop an organizational understanding of your cybersecurity risks. That is, many of us are not aware that we're at risk, and if we're not aware we're at risk, we're not going to take any actions. I just read a recent report, particularly in Latin America, that some countries, the culture is such that over half of all the people still have default passwords on their computers and on their devices and so on. So if you're not concerned about bank robbers or robbers breaking into your house, you're never going to lock your door. So the first thing is you have to be aware that there are risks. And that was a little bit of my goal in this first part, was just to give you just a tip of the iceberg. And the risks out there, let me tell you, are amazing. Some of them are quite amusing, but they are enormous number of risks out there. Now, for those of you in your companies who are concerned about these risks, the next thing you do is you try to protect yourself. And that's where most of the effort in most companies go. That is getting firewalls, virus screening devices, spam filters, and so on. And that's great news. But unfortunately, you can only do it so far. And in many cases, there are ways around them, particularly if the attacker is very motivated and diligent. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't do these things, but unfortunately, too many people assume that having done these, it's all over. That's all they need to worry about. My concern is that, yes, that will help keep the bad guys out, but what do you do if the bad guys do get in? That's the next level of issues I'm concerned about. First thing we need to do is detect it. Now, once again, there's been various reports and they differ, but they indicate basically that cyber attackers can often be inside your system. I think on average in the Western, that is the US and Europe, on average 200 days before the cyber attack is detected. And I've been told by other reports that in the Asia Pacific region, that number can rise as high as 400 days. In fact, it's interesting, in at least half of the studies I looked at, the cyber detection was done not by the company, but by some outside force. In some cases, the hacker happens to be so glib about it, he boasts about having broken into your company. In other cases, the law enforcement agencies have detected a large number of certain credit card numbers being used and ask you, by the way, is it possible someone may have broken into your company? So the fact is, not only does a detection so long, they're often rely upon the luck of somebody outside your organization realizing you've been broken into. That does not indicate very much on our side. The joke I sometimes, if I call it a joke, is imagine you're running a bank and at 5 o'clock or whatever time your bank closes, one of the tellers walks out the door with a wheelbarrow full of money. Presumably it wouldn't go too long before someone says something's going wrong there. In a cyber event, that can go on for 400 days or 200 days before anybody even notices. So detection is a big issue, And most companies are woefully doing a poor job at it. The next issue is response. What do you do when a cyber attack takes place? Most organizations, once again, much like my example here of something event that's never happened before, if it hasn't happened before, usually you haven't thought about what to do. And all too often we find examples of companies making missteps. The CEO making an announcement and then hours later retracting what he just said because they hadn't really thought through what they're going to do and how they're going to deal with it. No, your company has just been hit by a ransomware attack. All of your data has been locked up. So whatever kind of business, you're a bank, you're an insurance company, you're a manufacturing company, all of a sudden you're shut down. You're being asked for a ransom. What do? Well, you say, well, according to our manual here, it says here, we never give ransoms. If someone is kidnapped, I'm sorry, we're not going to pay for it. That may be your policy. But then again, what if this shutdown has cost you $100 million a day? What do you do then? So a lot of times companies haven't thought it through. I'm not saying what you should do, but the point is, have you thought about it? And do you have a well worked out plan for whatever the cyber event might be? And then finally, how do you recover? How do you get your capability back? So for example, if your company has no power, no electric power for 3 weeks, how much can you operate and what can you do during that period of time? So those are just some examples of the kinds of things you can do. And once again, I'm only kind of giving you this high level flavor. For those of you who are doing these 5 things, great, and continue, and obviously it can be improved. For those of you who have not really delved into these kinds of issues before, this is the time to do so. Now, what I want to do in the remainder of my session today is talk to you a little bit about what is MIT doing about all of this. I got to give you a bit of background. About 6 years ago, we've been working on cybersecurity on and off for many years. In fact, I'd almost forgotten about the fact that in 1979, in fact, most of my students don't realize computers existed that far back, but in 1979, we co-authored a book called Computer Security. So we've been involved in cybersecurity on and off over decades. But about 6 years ago, we decided to form a new research group here at Sloan School. At that time, we called it the Interdisciplinary Consortium for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. That is a mouthful. But the initials are IC, or we called it ICQ. And that was the name we first started at. But over time, people realized that it was still a mouthful. And we have shortened it now to Cybersecurity at MIT Sloan, or CAMS. And so our website is cams.mit.edu. And you're welcome to go there to hear more about the kind of things we do. So what's the idea behind CAMS? Well, first thing we realized that conventional information systems, like the PCs that you may be looking at us right now, are important and can suffer cyber attacks. And there's lots of security mechanisms being developed for them, but obviously they're not totally effective. But what we felt also was that the security of these cyber physical structures, utilities, energy plants, chemical plants, transportation systems, is even more important, and remarkably less research has been done so far. So although we look at both traditional IT systems, we have a very special emphasis on what we call these cyber physical systems. But remember, we're working in the Sloan School of Management, and although we work with all parts of MIT, one thing that made us really interested in this issue is although lots of research has been done on improving hardware and software, including our colleagues that we work very closely with at MIT's CSAIL, Computer Science and AI Laboratory, and other parts of MIT. And although improving the hardware and software is helpful, various studies have emphasized the fact that 70 to 80, and some people claim even larger number of cyber attacks, are aided or abetted by insiders, usually unintentionally. One analogy I like to use is you can put a much stronger lock on your door, but if you're still leaving the key under the mat, are you in fact any more secure? So as Kerry Pearlson will talk to you later on, really having the people tend to be the weakest link in most cybersecurity events, and that's going to be a big issue to deal with. So that's why we believe it's so important to address the managerial, organizational, and strategic aspects of cybersecurity. So I'm going to do in the remaining minutes is first just point out to you that CAMS has a very rich research agenda. We have about 25 projects going on, looking at issues such as what is the role of the board of directors in addressing cyber attacks, what are the various technologies that people are working on and which ones are likely to be useful, and how do we deal with things in our organization. Good news for you, I'm not going to try to cover all 25 projects they're working on, but I do want to take one project to give you a little bit of the flavor of the kind of things we're doing and hopefully just give you some insight into it. And that's the work we're doing, we call on cyber safety. The motivation behind cyber safety is that a lot of research has been done around the world, including at MIT, on improving the safety of organizations, industrial safety, preventing accidents in factories and such. So what we wanted to do is say, can the research that has been done be used and adapted to help to identify and prevent cyber attacks? And we call this cyber safety. And we've used this mechanism to analyze past attacks such as Stuxnet and others, as well as to analyze possible future attacks, how to make organizations more resiliency. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavor of what that looks like. To understand it though, let me explain to you a little bit the basic principles behind cyber safety. The first one is we think of operating, we call top down. That is start by saying what it is that you're trying to protect or prevent. Sometimes this is referred to as the crown jewels. Let me give you an analogy. Let's assume that at MIT, there are 10,000 doors. And let's assume that at night, it would be desirable if all 10,000 doors were locked. But not all 10,000 doors are equally important in terms of what they're protecting. If we can identify which doors are protecting the most important things and put, let's say, additional resources to making sure those doors are in fact locks, we can increase our security. So we need to understand where to focus. The reason I say that is there are so many weaknesses in most organizations. If we try to deal with all of them equally, we're usually likely to leave the important ones unattended to. So that's important step number one. Number two, and this fits very well into our engineering way of thinking about things, is that every organization consists of processes. These processes may be mechanical, they may be computerized, they may be manual processes done by people. But for each of these processes, there are controllers who oversee the process, make sure it's behaving correctly, and take corrective action when necessary. So we have the process and we have this controller. But the controller itself is a process. And so there is a controller monitoring and controlling that controller, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this hierarchy of controllers and processes in organizations. That's the overall view. Now, this may be kind of abstract. In a few minutes, I'll give you a concrete example to make this clearer, but I hope it sounds interesting. Now, there are many examples I can give. And of course, some of the examples we've studied are fairly complex engineering systems, such as gas turbines and such, that may or may not be of interest or familiar to many of you. So I thought I'd take another case we have studied that might be more commonly familiar to many people here. And that is to study the attack on TJX. For those who aren't familiar with TJX, it's the parent company of the retail stores, particularly in the United States and Canada, I believe also in England, of TJ Maxx, Marshalls, and Home Goods. They have hundreds of stores in each of these countries. They suffered a cyber attack in 2007. That's almost 13 years ago. I'll come back to the issue of why it's still relevant today. But the reason why we thought it was interesting was at the time, it was the largest cyber attack where 45 million credit cards were stolen. And also because it was an attack that got so much visibility that a lot of information was made publicly available. And so that's very helpful because, as I said earlier, one of the big problems we have, a lot of times cyber attacks are not reported at all, or if they are reported, very, very little information is communicated. So this one allowed us to do a really detailed analysis. Now, this diagram is probably a bit small for anybody to read, and we're not going to go through it in great detail, But this is what I mean by a hierarchical control structure. The hierarchical control structure, at the very bottom of it, we have a TJX retail store. So as the stories in the newspapers go, they will tell you that this cyber attack took place due to a misconfigured Wi-Fi setup at a Marshall store in a suburban shopping mall outside of Miami, Florida. And often that's kind of the start of the story and the end of the story. But the question is, how did that happen? And how did the magnitude of this cyber attack get to be so large? And in order to understand that, we need to understand what were the controls in place that should have prevented this from happening. And how did those controls fail? And how did the control of those controls fail, etc. So in fact, you really need to look at the entire structure in order to deal with this correctly. I'm going to take a quick digression and point out time and time again, we have found, I call it management semi-decision making, that management makes decisions, but not really realizing the consequence of the decision that it makes. And so we'll see the examples of that in this. So I'm just going to take a few seconds on this example. We do have a relatively detailed report, and those who are interested in this, in our other studies, including gas turbines and such, we encourage you to contact us. But what I want to do is go way up here to the upper left corner of the screen here. This is the state legislature. What is the connection between the state legislature and a Marshall's retail store in a shopping mall? The answer goes as follows. In the retail credit card business, there is something called PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. It's a set of recommendations that retail operations should follow in order to protect it. It turns out that there is a voluntary, to a large extent, set of recommendations. For those of you who may remember MIT location, TJX's headquarters is located in Framingham, Massachusetts, about a 15-minute drive from MIT. If TJX headquarters had been in Nevada, the state of Nevada in the United States, the state legislature had required that all retail organizations based in that state must have PCI DSS compliance. Massachusetts did not have that as a requirement, and as it turned out, TJX was not PCI DSS compliant. So all these different layers that I show you here all play a role in both creating the environment, enabling this attack, and allowing this attack to become as magnitude as it was. What I'm going to do is just zoom in on one of these controllers. And once again, all the others have similar issues, if you will. And that's looking at the payment card processing system. So what I'm going to do, this is part of our analysis. First, we say, what is it that we want that controller to do? And there are several things. Number one, we want to make sure that the data is encrypted. So if the data is ever stolen, there would be no harm done. Secondly, of course, a part of the mechanism of doing that would be make sure that TJX is PCI DSS compliant. And compliance includes many things, including encrypting data, as well as other things. You also want to make sure that you're only retaining data that's necessary. If you don't have the data, then nobody can steal it. That seems obvious, but it's amazing how many organizations just keep data forever and ever and ever, not realizing it's not providing them value except possibly to criminals. And of course, you want to make sure that your systems are well tested. And these are all good things you would imagine to want to control. But in fact, many things were not that way. In particular, TJX was not compliant with PCI DSS. And there were many what we call unsafe decisions. These are managerial decisions. Manager may not realize they're making these decisions, but in fact, this is what happened. They in fact were not compliant, as I mentioned. They were retaining much more data for much longer periods of time than necessary. They were storing a lot of data that was unencrypted. And although they had received warnings from people like Visa saying, hey, you realize that you're sending us unencrypted data and that's not in compliance with PCI DSS, they in fact did nothing about it. And of course, there's several reasons why we think this all happened. One is that that much of upper management was not aware, or not fully aware that they were not PCI DSS compliant. They were not aware of the consequences of not being compliant, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a set of conditions that we want to meet, and there are a number of issues for why those conditions were in fact not being met. So I want to wrap this up by talking a little bit about what we learned from this case. Professor Levinson at MIT Aeronautics is a developer of the method we adapted for cyber safety. And one of the famous quotes he has, in most major accidents are a result of migration of a system to a high-risk state over time. And what I mean by that is that we're familiar with things we've done for decades or hundreds of years, but we're not familiar with the consequences of new things we're doing. And guess what? We're in an era where we're doing new things all the time. In particular, I'm going to talk to you about three particular elements. Number one, many of you may be using Wi-Fi right now, but it may not be surprised to you, Wi-Fi is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. And when TGX first started using Wi-Fi back in the early 2000s, it was one of the first retail organizations to do so. And they were not fully aware of the consequences because nobody had broken into Wi-Fi systems since they didn't exist before. And so they, in fact, were not particularly concerned about it because they had no prior experience of it having happened. And that falls into what I call the recall bias. That is, if you've never been broken into before, you assume you will not be broken into later. I talked to a colleague once who explained to me that 50% of all home burglar alarm systems are sold within 2 weeks after the house has been broken into. The house down the street may have been broken into, but it's never happened to us, so most likely we're safe. And that's a big mistake so many organizations make. And then finally, we call it the confirmation trap. One of the things that was very fortunate about this case, as I said, a lot of documentation was revealed through the various investigations that went on. This is actually an excerpt of an email from the CIO of TGX to his staff. I won't read the details of it, but the gist goes as follows. Hello, staff. We all realize that we are not PCI DSS compliant, and we really should be. But that's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of cost. And we're now approaching the Christmas season. We're going to be very busy. And of course, budgets have been very tight this year. Don't you all agree with me that it would be okay if we deferred PCI compliance until next year? This may shock you, but in fact, almost all of his staff agreed with him. And in fact, they didn't bother to get PCI compliance. We have found similar cases in the Challenger Space Shuttle decision to launch, in the Equifax hack, and the recent Capital One hack. People fall into these traps over and over again, even decades later. In our study, although the TGX was studied extensively by the Federal Trade Commission in the United States and its counterpart in Canada, there were lots of things that we learned by using Cybersafety that none of their reports identified. So Cybersafety is a very effective way to realize where are there control weaknesses in your systems. So I want to conclude. First, I want to thank you and appreciate your patience and looking forward to your questions and comments. Please make sure you enter them as soon as you can. So my conclusion is the worst is yet to come. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, in fact, we're going to more and more technology, whether it be information, smart grids, Internet of Things. One example I often give is I now have an electric toothbrush that is Wi-Fi connected, so it sends reports to my cell phone. If I was a child, these reports could be sent to my parent. They could be forwarded to your dentist. You know, more and more we're finding ourselves more and more connected to as a world. And we need to understand that everything is at risk. There's a lot of concerns now about your well-being, political stability, election systems, and so on. You need to really fully understand these risks. If you don't understand these risks, you won't take the necessary actions to be more resilient. But those of you, particularly those of you in managerial positions, but in all positions, need to take an action, to take the lead. As I said at the beginning, we look forward to being in contact with you and be glad to answer further questions. I'll turn it back over to Yuri now.
Okay, Stuart, thanks for the amazing presentation. And the TJX case, although like, kind of old, 13 or 14 years old, it still teaches, many lessons. So yeah, we do have questions. I will start with this one. No matter how good one's encryption is, there are still breaches, mostly through firewall weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
Not from unencrypted data.
Well,
So, right.
there's a great study done. I think it was the University of North Carolina. We actually had an article recently in the Wall Street Journal that was called "A Lot of Processes for Passwords Don't Help," and what they learned is that 50% of all the passwords they were able to determine what they were. Because people typically reuse the same passwords over and over again. That becomes Madnick 1, becomes Madnick 2, becomes Madnick 3, and so on. So even when you do encrypt your data, a lot of times there are easy ways to find it. The second thing is I jokingly use the comment of leaving your key under the mat. When in fact, it's surprising how often these keys for decrypting the data are in the same place where the data is. We've seen that happen. So you steal the encrypted data, but then you also steal the keys. And once you've got the keys, you can then encrypt it, unencrypt it. So don't get me wrong, encrypting your data is definitely a useful step, but it isn't the ending step. You have to think about the whole process.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does leadership need to be cyber literate? How do you best address this?
Well, cyber literate falls into many categories. That those who do not know need to know the binary number system and know how to the opt codes for all the computers and so on. As I said before, a lot of the failures, if you will, really are logical failures. Do not involve technology. If you will, I don't need to understand the mechanics of the lock on my door, but I need to understand that putting the key under the mat is probably not a good idea. So yes, the more you know, the better off you are, but it's amazing. A small amount of technical knowledge, which I'm sure most of your audience are more than capable of, is all that's needed. It's really need to think through the processes. It's almost always, it's funny, in almost every event, the headline usually is, this was preventable.
Okay.
My question then, why wasn't it prevented? So in most cases, the amount of technical knowledge needed is mine. Obviously, you need to have that in your staff and in your IT group to know to put up the appropriate firewalls and such. But so many of these things, we just completed a study of the Capital One break-in, and we found 62 control failures.
Oh. Is this study public or not, Stuart? The Capital One?
It is. It's a report, a working paper we have. In fact, we're also submitted to a journal, but it is on our working paper site. So if you contact us, we'll definitely give you the email address for it or the URL for it.
Okay, thank you. So we do have several questions, but since we need to jump to our second talk, your last question for this session. As IoT expands to all areas of life and our dependence on our smartphones is increasing, what can individuals do to increase security against attacks like identity theft, obtaining credit card information, etc.?
Well, once again, I'll try to keep it brief because time is short. It's interesting enough, I use this joke. I don't know how many of you remember back a couple of decades ago, you'd visit your neighbor's house and you'd notice next to the TV was their VCR. And the VCR was still blinking 12. And my point is, if people didn't bother to set the clock on the VCR, did they bother to set the password on their security camera? One study indicated 50% of all home security cameras still have default passwords on them. So there is an enormous number of relatively trivial things we can do that we just don't think of doing. That's just one example. But that affects all kinds of IoT devices.
All right. So thanks again, Stuart. So
Thank you.
I'm going to have you back for your second talk in a few. So thank you very much. We're going to now let's jump to our